All right, let's dive into this. We're taking a deep dive into ethical non-monogamy today. And you've given me some really interesting excerpts from Ethical Slut. So let's unpack this together. I think a lot of people, when they think about open relationships, they immediately go to jealousy. So I'm curious to see how this book tackles that concept.
Yeah, jealousy is often seen as like a big obstacle, but Ethical Slut kind of flips that on its head, and they suggest that we look at jealousy as a teacher.
Okay, so how does jealousy become a teacher?
Well, the book argues that jealousy often points to deeper insecurities or unmet needs that we might have. So instead of trying to just push those feelings down, we should sort of lean into them and see what they're trying to tell us.
I see. So using those feelings as a way to learn more about ourselves, but how do we actually do that? It's one thing to say embrace your jealousy, but it's another thing to actually deal with those raw, sometimes really painful emotions.
Right, it's not about letting jealousy control us. But Ethical Slut offers some pretty practical strategies. For example, recognizing that jealousy is often a mask for some deeper fear, like fear of abandonment or fear of not being good enough. So by addressing those underlying anxieties, we can start to kind of dismantle the power that jealousy has over us.
So turning inward instead of outward.
Yeah.
Instead of blaming our partner or trying to control their behavior, we look at ourselves and ask, okay, what's really going on here for me?
Exactly.
And the book encourages us to then explore those needs in healthy ways, whether it's through self-care, open communication with our partner, or even seeking therapy.
Right. It's about building a strong foundation of self-love and security rather than relying on external validation from our relationships.
Yeah, I think so much of the anxiety around relationships, whether monogamous or not, comes from that fear of losing ourselves. So building that inner strength seems crucial. Now, speaking of relationships, the book also talks about the importance of communication and agreements, right?
Definitely. And what's interesting is that Easton and Hardy advocate for positive agreements, which means agreements that focus on what you want to create in the relationship rather than what you don't want.
Okay, so instead of it being a list of restrictions, it's more about what are we trying to build here? How do we create a dynamic that feels good for both of us?
Yeah, exactly. They give an example of this couple, Lori and Chris, who, started with a very limited agreement, but then as their relationship progressed, they kind of opened things up and renegotiated their boundaries, which really highlights the fact that these agreements are not set in stone. They need to be fluid and adaptable to the changing needs of the relationship.
That's a really important point because I think a lot of people think that ethical non-monogamy is this free-for-all, but it actually requires a ton of communication and ongoing dialogue.
Mhm.
And speaking of communication, I'm curious about how the book addresses those challenges of opening up an existing relationship, because that could be really tough, especially if one partner is more into the idea than the other.
It can definitely be delicate. The book acknowledges that there's a lot of emotions that can come up during that transition, like anxiety, guilt, resentment, and it really stresses the need for patience, empathy, and a willingness to work through those difficult feelings as a couple.
It's not about one person pushing the other one into something they're not comfortable with.
Right, exactly. And they even introduce this concept of a hierarchy of hard, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, what is that?
Basically, it involves breaking down the transition into smaller steps.
So instead of jumping straight into having separate dates, maybe a couple might start by just like looking at dating profiles together or talking about their fantasies.
Exactly. It's about finding a pace that feels comfortable for both partners.
Yeah, like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in the deep end.
Exactly. And the book also reminds us that, communication isn't just a one-time thing. It needs to be an ongoing, evolving
Hmm.
process.
All right, because people change, desires change. What feels right today might not feel right a year from now, and that's okay. But as long as you have that open line of communication, you can navigate those shifts together.
Exactly. It's about creating that space where both partners feel heard, validated, and respected throughout the whole process.
Okay, so we've talked about jealousy, we've talked about communication, and the delicate dance of opening up a relationship. What other insights does Ethical Slut have for us?
Well, it also gets into the nitty-gritty of maintaining a thriving relationship, whether it's monogamous or non-monogamous.
Because even in the best relationships, things can sometimes get a little stale, right?
Absolutely. Routine can definitely dampen the spark. So Ethical Slut offers some advice for how to keep things fresh and exciting.
Okay, like what? Spill the tea.
Well, first, they emphasize addressing any, physical discomforts or unspoken concerns about sex. It's about creating a space where both partners feel safe to express those needs and desires, even if they're not always easy to articulate.
That's so important. I think a lot of couples just kind of avoid those conversations
They do.
because they're afraid of hurting the other person's feelings. But then, those unspoken things can really fester and cause problems down the line.
Exactly. They can erode the intimacy.
Yeah.
So the book also encourages couples to schedule dedicated time for pleasure and intimacy.
Oh, I love that. Like putting a date night on the calendar, but with a much more, playful intention.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, they talk about exploring new activities, expanding your sexual repertoire, trying new things, breaking out of those familiar routines.
Yeah, inject a little fun into things.
Exactly. They even have this exercise called writing the great sex story, which is basically like writing erotic fan fiction about each other.
Oh, wow. That sounds hot.
Yeah,
So it's all about tapping back into that sense of discovery and excitement that you had at the beginning of the relationship.
exactly.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but we've got more to unpack, so let's keep going, shall we? All right, what else does Ethical Slut have for us?
One of the things they talk about is the challenge of finding and connecting with like-minded people, which, especially for people in sexual minorities who already have limited options, can be really tricky.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, finding partners who are open to non-monogamy is one thing, but then finding people who are compatible with your specific values and desires is a whole other challenge. How does the book suggest we approach that?
Well, honesty and transparency from the start are key, obviously. But they also encourage focusing on personal values and boundaries when you're looking for partners.
So being really clear about what ethical non-monogamy means to you and then seeking out partners who align with that vision.
Exactly. And they have this funny story about Janet accidentally sliding into cohabitation with someone who wasn't a good fit just because she wasn't clear about her boundaries.
Oh, wow. That's a reminder that even in this world of, ethical non-monogamy and open communication, it's still really important to be intentional about the types of relationships that you're creating. You don't want to end up in a situation that doesn't feel right just because you're afraid to have those tough conversations.
Right.
Well, this has already been such a great deep dive, and I can't wait to see where it goes next.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation so far. And building on what we've already talked about, I think it's important to touch on how Ethical Slut approaches conflict resolution in non-monogamous relationships.
That's a really good point because a lot of times people see conflict as a negative thing, like something to be avoided at all costs. But I'm curious to hear how this book kind of reframes that perspective.
Well, Easton and Hardy suggest that conflict, when approached constructively, can actually be an opportunity for growth and deeper intimacy.
Okay, so instead of seeing conflict as this like threat to the relationship, it's more about seeing it as a chance to learn and evolve together as individuals and as a couple.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from winning an argument to really trying to understand each other's perspectives and finding solutions that work for everyone.
I love that. So how do we navigate those waters? What are some practical tips for, approaching conflict in a healthy way in a non-monogamous relationship?
Well, one of the key takeaways from the book is the importance of vulnerability. It's about being willing to show up authentically with your partner and share your emotions, even the messy ones.
That can be tough though, right?
Yeah.
Because we're often told to like keep those emotions bottled up.
It can be really challenging. But the book argues that it's in those moments of shared vulnerability that true connection happens.
It's like when we let our guard down and allow ourselves to be seen, that's when intimacy can really flourish.
Right. And it's also about being a safe space for your partner to do the same.
Yeah, to create an environment where everyone feels comfortable expressing their needs and concerns
Yeah,
without judgment.
exactly. And another thing they talk about is that, we all come to relationships with these different scripts for handling conflict based on how we were raised and our past experiences.
Right. So someone who grew up in a family where like conflict was always swept under the rug might have a totally different approach than someone who grew up in a family where, arguments were loud and passionate.
Exactly. And understanding those differences can help us communicate more effectively.
Yeah, instead of getting frustrated or taking things personally, we can like try to see things from their perspective and meet them where they are.
Exactly. And the book also talks about taking time outs when things get heated.
Oh, that's a good one. Sometimes you just need to step away and cool off before you can have a productive conversation.
Absolutely. It's about giving yourself space to process those emotions before you try to resolve the issue.
So what's the best way to use that time out? Any tips?
They suggest engaging in self-soothing activities like journaling, listening to music, going for a walk, anything that helps you kind of regulate your nervous system.
Okay, so once everyone's calmed down a bit, how do you suggest approaching the conversation again?
The book emphasizes using I statements to express your feelings rather than you statements, which can sound blaming.
Right. So instead of saying, you always do this, it's more about saying, I feel hurt when this happened.
Exactly. It's about owning your emotions.
And also, like, really listening to your partner's perspective without interrupting or trying to fix their feelings.
Yeah, sometimes all someone needs is to feel heard and validated.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
this is all great advice for any relationship, really. But let's circle back to the idea of opening up an existing relationship. I'm curious to delve a little deeper into the, like, practicalities of that transition.
It's definitely a process that requires a lot of care and communication. And the book really emphasizes respecting the feelings of the partner who might be hesitant about opening up.
Yeah, it's not about pressuring or coercing someone into something they're not ready for.
Right. It's about having those open and honest conversations, exploring concerns, and finding a way to move forward together.
You mentioned that concept earlier, the hierarchy of hard. Could you remind us what that is and how it might be helpful in this situation?
Sure. So the hierarchy of hard is basically a way of breaking down the transition into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of jumping right into having separate dates, a couple might start by browsing dating profiles together, or just talking about their fantasies and what they might be curious about.
Right. It's about slowly expanding the comfort zone and building trust along the way.
And honesty is super important throughout that whole process, right?
Definitely. Both with each other and with any potential new partners.
Right, being upfront about the fact that you're in an open relationship and what that means for you.
Exactly. And having those regular check-ins with your partner about how you're both feeling as you navigate these new waters.
We've talked a lot about the challenges of ethical non-monogamy, but I'm curious about the rewards too. What are some of the positive aspects that the book highlights?
Well, one of the biggest rewards, according to Ethical Slut, is the potential for personal growth.
Okay, yeah. When you're challenging those conventional relationship norms, it's going to push you to grow and evolve as a person.
Exactly. It forces you to confront those beliefs about love, commitment, and what it means to be in a relationship.
And it also helps you develop those skills like communication, emotional intelligence, and understanding your own needs and desires.
Absolutely. And those are skills that can benefit all areas of your life, not just romantic relationships.
So it's not just about being a better partner, it's about becoming a more well-rounded person overall.
Right. Another reward that they talk about is the potential for greater intimacy and connection.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I think a lot of people assume that non-monogamy would lead to less intimacy, not more.
Exactly. But Easton and Hardy argue that when you're not relying on one person to fulfill all of your needs, you can actually have deeper connections with multiple people.
It's like diversifying your sources of love and support.
Right, and appreciating the unique qualities of each relationship.
So instead of trying to make every relationship look the same, you allow them to flourish in their own ways.
Exactly. And while we've been focusing a lot on romantic relationships, Ethical Slut also emphasizes nurturing all of your relationships. Friendships, family relationships, and even your relationship with yourself.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to forget about those other important connections when you're caught up in your romantic life.
It is. But all of those relationships contribute to our overall happiness and well-being.
So it's about creating this rich tapestry of different types of connections that all support us in different ways.
Exactly.
Wow, this conversation is just blowing my mind. What else does Ethical Slut have in store for us?
Let's talk about keeping the spark alive in long-term relationships.
Yes, because even in the best relationships, things can get a little routine after a while.
Absolutely. An Ethical Slut acknowledges that passion and intimacy can fade over time.
So what are some practical tips for, like, reigniting that spark and keeping things fresh?
Well, communication is crucial, as always. Being honest about your needs and desires, even if they've changed since the beginning of the relationship.
And just making time for each other, right?
Right.
Whether it's a regular date night or just, like, 15 minutes a day to cuddle and talk.
Definitely. And don't underestimate the power of novelty. Trying new things together can really shake things up and bring back some of that initial excitement.
I love that.
Remember that exercise we talked about earlier, writing the great sex story? That can be a fun way to explore fantasies and reignite that erotic spark.
Oh, yeah. That was a good one. But keeping the spark alive isn't just about sex, right?
Right. It's also about emotional connection.
Like being present with each other, expressing appreciation, and really listening to each other.
Exactly. Those small gestures can make a big difference.
So communication, quality time, novelty, and those little acts of love and appreciation are all important ingredients in a healthy long-term relationship.
They are.
This is all so insightful.
Yeah.
What else does Ethical Slut have for us?
Let's dive into the practicalities of polyamorous relationships, specifically the importance of clear agreements and boundaries.
Okay, I'm all ears. What do they have to say about that?
Well, one key point is that agreements should be tailored to the specific needs of the people involved. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
So what works for one couple might not work for another.
Right. And communication is key to figuring out what those needs and desires are.
Yeah, you can't just assume everyone's on the same page. You have to have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations to make sure everyone's boundaries are being respected.
Absolutely. And another important point is that agreements aren't static. They can evolve and change as the relationship dynamics shift.
Right, so it's not about setting those boundaries in stone and never revisiting them. It's about being flexible and willing to renegotiate when needed.
Exactly.
Okay, so what other practical tips does the book offer for managing polyamorous relationships?
Well, one thing that stood out to me is the emphasis on scheduling and time management.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you're juggling multiple relationships, it can be tough to make sure everyone feels loved and prioritized.
Right. So they encourage being proactive about scheduling time with each partner and communicating clearly about availability.
So it's not just about going with the flow, it's also about being organized and intentional.
Exactly. And respecting everyone's time and commitments.
What else do they say?
Another thing they emphasize is being mindful of how your actions impact others.
That's a really good point. In polyamorous relationships, your choices don't just affect you and your partner.
Right. Your actions can have ripple effects on other people involved.
So you have to be thoughtful and considerate.
Absolutely. It's about making choices that are ethical and responsible.
This is also fascinating. What other wisdom can we find in Ethical Slut?
One thing that I think is really valuable is their discussion of compersion.
Oh yeah, compersion. We talked about that briefly earlier, but I'd love to hear more about it.
So compersion is that feeling of genuine happiness you experience when you see your partner happy in their other relationships.
It's like the opposite of jealousy, right?
Exactly. Instead of feeling threatened, you're actually happy for them.
That's such a beautiful concept. But I imagine it can be really hard to cultivate, especially if you're used to more traditional ideas about relationships.
It can definitely take some work, but Ethical Slut suggests that it's a worthwhile pursuit.
Okay, so what are the benefits of compersion?
Well, for one, it can increase your own happiness.
Okay,
When you're able to celebrate your partner's joy, it expands your own capacity for joy.
like their happiness becomes your happiness.
Exactly. And it can also strengthen your relationship with your partner because it creates this foundation of trust and security.
When you know your partner is happy and fulfilled, it can reduce some of those anxieties that can sometimes pop up in relationships.
Absolutely. And it can also create this sense of mutual support and encouragement.
So instead of competing for attention, you're both cheering each other on.
Exactly. It's about creating abundance, not scarcity.
I love that. So how do you actually cultivate compersion?
One thing they suggest is practicing gratitude, focusing on the positive aspects of your partner's other relationships and appreciating the joy that those relationships bring to their life.
So instead of focusing on your own insecurities, you're choosing to focus on the good things.
Right. And it's also about challenging those possessive thoughts that can come up.
Like the idea that your partner's love for someone else means they love you less.
Exactly. It's about understanding that love is not a finite resource.
This is so powerful. Okay, we've covered so much ground today, from jealousy and communication to opening up relationships, keeping the spark alive, and even compersion. What else is there to explore in Ethical Slut?
One thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that navigating non-monogamy in a predominantly monogamous society can be challenging.
Yeah, that's a great point. I
Yeah.
mean, it's one thing to understand and embrace these ideas personally, but it's another thing to deal with the judgments and misunderstandings of others.
Right. And Ethical Slut addresses this directly, offering advice on how to navigate those social situations.
Okay, so what do they suggest?
Well, first, they emphasize choosing your battles wisely.
So you don't have to feel like you need to educate everyone you meet about ethical non-monogamy.
Exactly. Not everyone is going to be receptive.
And sometimes it's just not worth the energy.
Right. But when you do choose to talk about your relationship style, they suggest doing so with confidence and clarity.
Yeah, being able to explain your choices in a way that feels authentic and empowering.
Exactly. And setting boundaries with people who are disrespectful.
It's about owning your choices and surrounding yourself with people who support you.
Absolutely. They also encourage finding community with other like-minded individuals.
Yeah, it can be so validating to connect with people who understand your experiences.
It can. And it helps to normalize non-monogamy.
So finding your tribe, whether online or in person, can be a really important part of this whole journey. This conversation has been so insightful. It feels like we've just scratched the surface of all the wisdom that Ethical Slut has to offer.
Yeah, me too.
But I know we're running out of time, so let's start to wrap things up. What are some key takeaways that you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that ethical non-monogamy is a journey, not a destination.
It's an ongoing process of learning and growth.
Exactly. And it requires you to be willing to challenge those preconceived notions about love and relationships.
Yeah, it's about stepping outside those boxes that society has created.
Right. And it's about prioritizing communication, honesty, and vulnerability.
That's so well said.
It's about creating a life that feels authentic to you and your partner.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we sign off, is there any final thought or piece of advice you'd like to share? Something for our listener to think about as they continue exploring this world?
I'd say approach this journey with curiosity, compassion, and an open mind. Ethical non-monogamy isn't for everyone, but for those who choose this path, it can be incredibly rewarding.
It's about embracing the unknown and challenging yourself to create a life that's full of love and connection.
Exactly.
Wow, this has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, we wish you all the best on your journey. Remember, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's about finding what works for you.
Happy exploring.
You know, we could talk about this all day, but we are running a little low on time. Before we wrap up, is there anything else from Ethical Slut that we haven't touched on yet?
Um, yeah, there's one more thing that I think would be interesting to our listeners. The book talks about the experience of being the other lover in a polyamorous relationship.
Oh, yeah. That's a really interesting perspective.
It kind of challenges those traditional relationship roles and makes us question those assumptions about what makes a relationship real or valid.
Yeah, instead of seeing the other lover as somehow like important, it's about acknowledging that those connections can be just as meaningful and fulfilling.
Exactly. And the book really encourages us to see each relationship as unique and valuable in its own way.
And I imagine communication and boundaries are still super important in those relationships too.
Absolutely. It's about being honest about your needs and expectations and making sure everyone feels respected and valued.
So clear communication and mutual respect are essential, whether you're the primary partner or the other lover.
Right. And the book gives some practical advice for navigating these relationships, like setting aside dedicated time for each other and making agreements about what information can be shared with the primary partner.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Respecting the existing dynamics while also nurturing that individual connection.
Exactly. And recognizing that each relationship has its own unique joys and challenges.
So instead of getting caught up in comparing or ranking relationships, it's more about appreciating the beauty of each connection for what it is.
Yeah, well said.
As we wrap up this deep dive into ethical non-monogamy, I'm feeling really inspired by all the possibilities. It's a complex landscape for sure, but it's also full of potential for growth, connection, and fulfillment.
Yeah, I think Ethical Slut does a great job of providing a framework for people who are interested in exploring this path.
It challenges us to question those societal norms around love and relationships and encourages us to create a life that feels truly authentic.
It's about defining love and commitment on your own terms.
And realizing that there's no one right way to do relationships.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
Before we go, is there any final piece of advice you'd like to offer our listeners? Something to keep in mind as they continue to explore this topic.
I would just say approach this journey with an open mind and a lot of compassion. Ethical non-monogamy isn't for everyone, but it can be an incredibly rewarding experience.
It's about pushing your boundaries
Yeah.
and creating a life that's rich in love and connection. And remember, there are resources and communities out there to support you, so don't be afraid to reach out.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Thank you so much for listening, and we wish you all the best on your journey of exploration.